In the summer of 1971, 24 ordinary college students responded to a newspaper ad asking for male participants in a psychological study. They were screened, assessed, and found psychologically healthy. Then they were assigned, at random, to play the role of either a guard or a prisoner in a simulated prison in the basement of Stanford University's psychology department. The study was supposed to last 2 weeks. It was terminated after 6 days. And what happened in those 6 days changed how we understand the relationship between power and human cruelty. The lead researcher was Philip Zimbardo, a Stanford psychology professor who designed the study to investigate how institutional environments shape behavior. The question was deceptively simple: when ordinary people are given power over others, what do they do with it? The hypothesis was that situational factors, the roles people are assigned, matter more than individual character. The experiment didn't just test the hypothesis. It seemed to prove it with terrifying efficiency. The prisoners were picked up at their homes by actual Palo Alto police officers, without prior warning. They were booked, strip-searched, deloused, given prison uniforms, and assigned numbers instead of names. Their identity was being stripped away from the moment the experiment began. Guards were given uniforms, mirrored sunglasses to prevent eye contact, and wooden batons. They were told to maintain order. They were not given specific instructions on how. That ambiguity turned out to be crucial. Within 24 hours, something unexpected happened. A guard who later said he had entered the experiment determined to be kind began harassing prisoners unprovoked. Not because he had been told to. Not because he was cruel by disposition. But because the uniform, the power differential, and the social environment had begun to act on him. By day 2, guards were waking prisoners at 2 a.m. for arbitrary roll calls. They were assigning degrading tasks. They were inventing humiliations that no protocol required. The prisoners, meanwhile, showed signs of psychological deterioration within 36 hours. One prisoner began screaming, crying uncontrollably, and was released after a few days. Others showed signs of intense anxiety, depression, and helplessness. One prisoner went on a hunger strike and was placed in solitary confinement, a small closet. The other prisoners were told they could earn his release by surrendering their blankets. They refused. Many of them later expressed shame about that decision. The most chilling detail of the standard account is what happened to Zimbardo himself. He wasn't just the researcher. He was playing a role too, the prison superintendent. He became so immersed in the simulation that he began making decisions to protect the institution rather than the participants. When a graduate student and former student, Christina Maslach, visited the basement on day 5 and was disturbed by what she saw, Zimbardo initially defended the experiment. She told him, "What you are doing to these boys is terrible." That night, he shut it down. This is the version of the Stanford Prison Experiment that most people learn in psychology textbooks. And it is gripping. But in 2018, investigative journalist Ben Blum obtained previously unheard audio recordings and conducted interviews that complicated the narrative substantially. What emerged was a story with significant methodological problems that Zimbardo had not disclosed, and that change what the experiment can actually tell us. The recordings revealed that a graduate student assistant had actively coached the guards before and during the experiment, telling them to be tough, to not let prisoners rest, to make them feel helpless. This coaching was not in the published accounts. A prisoner who had previously worked in a prison described realizing early on that the experiment wasn't testing what it claimed and choosing to play the role of a deteriorating prisoner deliberately, as a kind of protest performance. These revelations don't mean the experiment produced nothing of value. But they complicate the most powerful claim, that ordinary, uncoached people placed in roles of authority will spontaneously and inevitably become cruel. The experiment may have shown something real about how institutional power and explicit permission create conditions for cruelty, but it also may have shown how people follow explicit instructions when given by authority figures in lab coats. which is, coincidentally, what the Milgram experiments had already demonstrated. Later research has sought to isolate the actual mechanisms more rigorously. Alexander Haslam and Steve Riker, two British psychologists who conducted the BBC prison study in 2002 or replication with institutional ethical oversight, found results that complicated Zimbardo's conclusions. Their guards did not automatically become cruel. Some guards actually resisted oppressing prisoners and tried to form coalitions. The key variable appeared to be not role assignment but identification with a group that endorsed cruelty. What Haslam and Riker proposed was a social identity account. People become cruel when they identify with a group that frames cruelty as appropriate or necessary, a group whose ideology legitimizes harm. Zimbardo's experiment may have created that ideological environment through coaching. Without it, the automatic brutalization effect doesn't appear as reliably. This distinction matters enormously for understanding real-world atrocity. The Abu Ghraib prison abuse scandal in 2003 brought the Stanford Prison Experiment back into public discourse. Zimbardo himself testified as an expert witness for the defense, arguing that the military guards who abused Iraqi prisoners were responding to institutional conditions, not individual evil. His testimony was used and contested in ways that illustrated both the power and the limits of situational explanations for extreme behavior. The tension at the heart of the Stanford experiment and at the heart of decades of subsequent research is between two explanatory frameworks. The dispositional explanation says that people who do terrible things were always somewhat terrible. The situational explanation says that ordinary people, in the right circumstances, can be induced to do terrible things by the structure of the situation alone. The truth appears to be more uncomfortable than either position alone. Research by psychologist James Waller, documented in his book Becoming Evil, synthesizes decades of genocide research and finds that perpetrators of mass atrocity typically share a common profile: ordinary people who were placed in institutions that provided permission, peer pressure, incremental escalation, and dehumanizing ideology. The institution doesn't create evil from nothing. It activates and escalates what was latent, the capacity for harm that exists in virtually every human being. Dehumanization is the common thread. When people are assigned numbers instead of names, as prisoners were in Stanford, the psychological distance that makes harm uncomfortable is reduced. When they're described as animals, subhumans, or threats to a valued group, the inhibitions against harming them dissolve faster. This mechanism has been documented across genocides, war crimes, and institutional abuse. The method varies. The psychological infrastructure is consistent. The ethics of the Stanford Prison Experiment have been extensively criticized by institutional review boards since its publication. It would be impossible to conduct today under current research ethics standards. Participants were subjected to genuine psychological harm. Consent was inadequate. The boundaries between participant and research subject were systematically blurred. Zimbardo's own involvement as superintendent compromised his objectivity as a researcher. The experiment illuminated psychology, and it violated it simultaneously. Zimbardo's most significant contribution may ultimately be the concept he developed after the experiment, the Lucifer effect. His book by that name argues that understanding evil requires examining not just who does evil, but what systems, institutions, and situations create the conditions for ordinary people to do evil things. The question is not only what kind of person does this, but what kind of environment produces this behavior in ordinary people. That question has practical implications. If cruelty is partly a product of institutional structure, then institutional structure can be redesigned to reduce it. Better guard training, transparency, third-party oversight, anti-dehumanization protocols, clear ethical lines, these are not idealistic add-ons. They are behavioral engineering based on what social psychology has documented about how ordinary people behave in unmonitored power structures. The Stanford Prison Experiment, even accounting for its methodological flaws, raises a question that the human species has been reluctant to answer honestly. Under what conditions would you be capable of cruelty? Not the monsters in history books. Not the guards with personality disorders. You. What institutional structure, what social pressure, what ideological framing, what gradual escalation of small permissions would be required? The honest answer requires more than most people are willing to give. The experiment is flawed as science. But as a provocation, as a forcing function for a question about human nature that civilizations have consistently refused to take seriously, it remains invaluable. The guards who were coached to be cruel were also real people who chose to follow that coaching. The prisoners who deteriorated were real people who believed the simulation had power over them. The line between role and identity, between permission and choice, between situation and character, those lines are thinner than we'd like. That's the finding that survives every critique. 6 Days in a Basement in 1971 produced 50 years of debate about human nature, institutional power, and the conditions for cruelty. The experiment's legacy is not clean. But its questions are urgent. What does it mean that ordinary people, given permission and a uniform, move toward cruelty rather than away from it? What does it mean that a researcher immersed in a role of authority lost his objectivity as a scientist? What does it mean that the story we told for decades omitted inconvenient details? Each answer reveals something about us. The question is whether we're willing to look.